So I've come out here after work. Um, I was doing a little bit of playing around with it the other day, trying to get the timing right. I got to the point where I had it set to where I thought it was firing on top dead center. It turns out it's not. It's a little bit advanced, but it's okay because it does start and run at the moment. I can adjust it again later. I did have a lot of trouble getting it to start. I had been turning it over with the plugs out until I got the timing reasonably close, and then I put the spark plugs back in, and unfortunately when you have all of the plugs out, you have to be really careful you don't drop anything down the spark plug holes, because on the Riley 9 head it's going to go straight down a cylinder. And of course I lost one of the brass nuts that hold the plug leads in place, so I ended up spending quite a bit of time trying to fish that out. I was able to in the end. Made me think maybe brass nuts aren't the best idea. At least if it was the steel ones, I could have used a magnet on a stick to pull it out. As it was, I had to use some grease on the end of a piece of wire to move it to the middle of the piston, and then I was able to very carefully turn it over on the handle and bring the piston up until I could reach in with a pair of tweezers and pull the little nut out. But I have it working. It was very hard to start, and it is quite a cold day today, and it did start on a little bit of carb cleaner sprayed down the throats. And then I realized I completely forget that I haven't got the choke hooked up. So this is the choke. So it just needed some choke to start. It does start now. It's reasonably warmed up. It's not hot because obviously I don't have the cooling system in place, and I haven't yet bolted on the bottom of the water pump, but it should start. I also re-cleaned the gauge and then remembered that I'd cleaned it but not oiled it. So a few drops of light oil. I actually use model train locomotive oil. That seems to work well, and that's freed up the meter quite nicely, so that should now be working. And I also have the little electronic gauge hooked up just to compare. So this should start up. And this gauge like I say, I don't have the cooling system hooked up, and I've got the door shut, so I don't want to gas myself. But that all seems to be working quite well. The magneto's back on there. I had to go out yesterday for a few things, and I stopped into Super Cheap Auto, and I came across in their they've got a sort of shelf with bins in it just full of random hoses for some reason, and I think this one was $16, which is dirt cheap, so I grabbed that. I may end up using that one in there. I have to run from there down to the bottom of the water pump. So this is the water pump housing. I just need to make the little adapter that goes on there, and then I should be able to get all of that bolted on, get the radiator back in place, and refill the thing with coolant. That battery does turn the engine over fine even on a cold day like today. The first couple of turns, just as it gets the oil moving, can be a little bit painful, but that's one of the advantages of having the starter handle. I can actually turn it over on the starter just to get a little bit of oil moving around and remove any sort of stiction there. So it's looking good. It's coming back together. So continuing on with the fitting of the water pump, I now have the pump in place and the housing all in place, and I have the timing set to pretty much what it should be. One thing I'd quite like to get is the proper linkages for this. So my magneto, this has been modified, this little lever. I believe it should be longer and there should be a hole in it, and then there's normally a brass lever here with a ball end, and that's what engages with the advanced retard lever. What I've got here works, but it would be nice to have it all correct. But you can see with the water pump in there, there's not a lot of space. There's a hose that goes between here and the underside of the radiator coming down there. There's a 90-degree bend, and I do have that pipe. That's this one here. So this is a Gates hose. It's a standard 90-degree 32mm diameter bend. I think it's a 02 or a 03-0012, something like that. It's easy enough to find. And I was hoping to use these flexible hoses to make the connection from the side of the block here to the outlet of the pump, but there just isn't enough room. It's the Brooklands. There's so little room on the thing. Everything is so tight and so crammed in. There's just not much space. So what I ended up doing is making a steel pipe. This flange came with the water pump. I might remake this in aluminium at some point, but apparently they were steel on some cars, and I have seen pictures of another original car where it was copper, I believe. But I've made this up again because of the fit of everything being so tight. You can see it's actually on a slight angle, because if you try to go straight up, it hits the corner of the housing here. So you need to have it on a slight angle so it clears that. That will fit in there on top of those studs, and I've worked it out so that I can use another one of these 90-degree angles to go in like that, and that means the piping is all nice and neat and out of the way. Hopefully that should be fine. These pipes, I got this one locally. It took a little while to arrive because their website was wrong and they didn't actually have any in stock, and they had to order it from Australia, and it ended up taking about 3 weeks. They just didn't actually tell me that was what was happening, so I was sort of left confused for a little while. It turns out it's cheaper for me to get these from eBay in Australia shipped to New Zealand than buying them locally. So I think on eBay from Australia, one of these ended up costing me about $45, including shipping. The place in New Zealand I got them from was kind of it actually worked out to be a little bit more because of the rural postage that I have to pay. And if you get one of these from somewhere like Repco, who will I think they can get it in for you, they're $57. So again, it's just weird pricing, but it's just kind of annoying that it's cheaper to get it shipped from overseas than buying it locally, even though you can get them locally. And I'm pretty sure they all come from Australia anyway. So I've got another one of those on the way. Hopefully it won't be too long. Both of them will need cutting down, one to go here and one to go at the bottom. But I think that should work pretty well. I have the radiator in there. This is the shell's a little bit, there's a bit of flex in it. I may actually put it on rubber mounts down here, and eventually when the rest of the car is there, there'll probably be some sort of bracing that goes from here to the corners of the firewall just to keep that all rigid. But the radiator itself is kind of mounted on rubber inside there, so everything can move in relation to everything else. So it should be all nice and flexible. I did buy they're actually 8mm bolts, but that's good enough for me to be able to bolt the frame down, and I will replace them all with 5/16 BSF. The originals used kind of coach bolts, so they're like a coach bolt, but they're actually a countersunk coach bolt, so they sit flush in the timber. I don't really want to do that, because over time what ends up happening is the square head in the coach bolt will just spin in the wood. And I would rather keep it so that it's easy to take apart in the future. A normal coach bolt, if it spins like that, you can cut a slot in it, or you can at least grab the head with a pair of pliers. If it's countersunk and it's flush with the timber, you're not going to be able to get it out. So I'd just like to save either myself or someone in the future that headache. So I'm going to think of another way of doing that. I've started drawing up where the bolts go and what the different bits of bracketry are that need to go in there, the sort of little steel braces. So that will be the next thing I work on. This was that hose 03-0012. So that looks good. I've slowly started taking apart gauges to see what's happening. Some of these are really worn out, and I'm going to probably pick the worst one and maybe have a go at actually stripping that down, cleaning it up, just to understand how they work and see if I can rebuild one decent one out of the three I've got. Even then, I'm not sure it's the right TPI, not TPI, turns. So every speedo will have a certain number of turns on the input to display a certain speed on the face, and I don't know what the correct one actually is for the Riley. The speedo drive comes off the torque tube. Inside the torque tube down there, there's actually a bronze gear, and is it bronze? No, it's steel on the torque tube. And then this housing sits bolts around it, and that's what the speedo drive comes off. You can see there's actually a little slotted drive. This is the end of it, so a cable needs to go into that. It's not focusing very well. There we go. I need to get a new cable, which should be available from the spares, and I think it comes with a sort of end piece on there. Otherwise I'll end up having to make something, but it's not too big a deal. So one of the things I've just been looking at, trying to figure out, is there's an under tray that goes all the way along here, all the way up to the front. I think it goes all the way up to here, I'm not quite sure. It definitely goes under that piece where you sit. I believe at the back here it's just open. I don't think there's any floor there. I do need to make there's like a diagonal brace that goes across there, which is where the battery sits, so the battery lives in there. And the fuel tank obviously goes in here. I'm not sure if there's any sort of floor under that, whether or not I should be closing all of that off or not. Of course, it's always going to be fairly open because you've got the axle sitting above the chassis and you've got these big cutouts, and that's just how they were. With the fuel tank in here, you get a little tiny piece of usable boot space sort of in there, and the original cars used to actually keep a spare tire on top there, but I don't think it would fit on mine, and I haven't carried a spare tire in my cars for years, and I've never really needed one. So, you know, it's probably more worthwhile me upgrading my AA, Automobile Association membership, to get the the truck to get me home, rather than make it so I've got a spare wheel in there and I'm carrying that weight around and I have to buy another tire and rebuild another wheel and all that kind of thing. So I'll probably not carry a spare. That's basically what I'm saying there. Plus they're quite heavy. I can't remember what one of these wheels weighs. I think it's 15 kg, something like that. They're not light. So that's a weight saving. My tachometer cable is working well. The engine turns over nicely. I was worried I might need a bigger battery. Starting it was a bit hard, but that's because I keep forgetting that I need to give it some choke when it's cold. So I should probably wire that up. I did tweak this. I was not happy with the angle. I had this attachment on the other side, so it was at quite a strange sort of angle to drive that. And again, you can see there's just not much clearance around everything, but that's enough to get full wide open throttle. I think the next thing is bolt the frame to the chassis and start making the doors and the firewall and the seat back, I guess. So that pipe is in place now. It's come out pretty neat. There is clearance there. It's on enough of an angle that it's deliberately on an angle, and it doesn't look like it's just meant to be straight and isn't. And it sort of goes across the top of the engine. Fits in quite nicely on this side. That's all out of the way. And the hose clamps are out of the way so that when you're trying to keep this thing clean, you're not scraping your fingers on them and things like that. It's pity they've got those cross style heads, but that's okay. Minor detail, and that's kind of a replaceable wear item. So all I need to do is wait for the second elbow pipe to arrive, and then I can fit that on the bottom of the radiator, and that should be good. This is the fitting for the temperature probe. That's over here. I ended up soaking all of that in evaporust, and I just gave it a quick spray of black paint just so it doesn't rust, but that should fit in there quite nicely. And I think once I've got that bottom hose in place, that's actually the engine done, more or less. One thing I need to look at is when I've had the car running, I don't seem to be getting any voltage out of my dynamo. It did work. I had tested it previously. I'm sure I remember testing it on a mains powered electric drill, turning it over and checking that you were getting voltage out of it, but it doesn't seem to be working at the moment. Maybe one of the connections has come loose on the terminal block. I'm not really sure. I'm not too worried about that at the moment. Because I'm trying to use as many mechanical gauges as possible, the only real electrical load on this car will be the SU fuel pump, and that is going to live basically the firewall is a piece of timber that goes in here up to about this level, and then from that there's actually an aluminium box, I guess you would call it. So aluminium sheet comes down and across and then down somewhere in here. So the little starter, the end of the starter gear actually sticks into the passenger footwell. So the firewall is somewhere around here. On this little shelf there's the SU fuel pump is mounted, electrical SU fuel pump. I've got that, I rebuilt that some time ago. And the only other electrical thing is the lights. So should be good. I didn't quite get everything I wanted to finish today done, but I came pretty close, and it's all good progress. The rear half of the body is now bolted down. I've been looking at all of the pictures I've got of original cars and rebuilt cars and replicas and any Brooklands to get some idea of where everything is actually bolted down. And like a lot of things on these cars, it varies a lot. They're all over the place, to be honest. So what I take that to mean is I just need to do whatever works for me. So I figured out bolting the body down with 6 bolts at the rear. There's 2 there, and there's another one at the front there. This back one is quite a long way forward because there's actually a big casting inside there, which is what joins the chassis rails to the rear cross member. So you need to go a fair way forward to avoid that. And these bolts are sitting on top of the frame. The ones on the front half will have to be sunk in. I'll show why in a second. But I didn't sink these ones in because I think these bolts may end up doing double duty. Because I have to mount a fuel tank in here, and those bolts give me quite a convenient place where I can actually make the stand that the fuel tank sits in. So the fuel tanks are originally sort of circular. It's just a cylindrical tank. You can actually see, this is a saloon car one, but you can see it's just a big cylinder. So when I build the fuel tank, that'll give me convenient mounting places for the brackets that hold it all in. So that tail is now pretty much bolted down. It's not going anywhere. I do need to figure out the little sort of rubber mounts. I'm going to have little rubber pieces that actually go where the bolts go, so that the frame isn't actually sitting on the steel of the chassis, because you want a small gap there so that it can dry out, so you don't get moisture getting trapped in the gap and rusting everything out. So the rear half is now bolted down. I still need to do the front, and the front is going to have, I think it'll be 8 bolts. So one there, one in the middle, one close to the front of the doors, and one right at the front there. This is one of those details that seems to vary even from original car to original car. Some of them don't seem to have the one in the middle for some reason. So I'm probably going to include it. I'm guessing it can't hurt. There's still plenty of flex in the chassis, which is what you want. Flex in the chassis and flex in the body, in the frame, because everything moves on these cars. So that's all good. My pipe is all in there. I think I showed that before. That's come out really neatly. I'm quite pleased with that. And I've gone over the whole car literally with an oily rag. I've got it in this little plastic container. It's just a microfiber cloth, and I've just soaked it in WD-40 because the car was getting filthy. It keeps getting dusty. I've pulled out some old sheets. I'm going to actually start covering up now with dust sheets. I don't mind that sort of oily rag look. In fact, I prefer a car that looks used. I don't want it to be perfect and clean and that sort of thing, but it was really getting quite filthy. So I gave it all a big wipe down to get the dust off it. It just seems kind of funny that normally an oily rag car would be one that's ancient and you're rubbing it over to keep it going. It seems a bit wrong that I've got an oily rag car before I've even actually finished the car. So when it all comes apart again to be painted, or the chassis will need to be painted, I'll have to make sure it's really, really clean, of course, and then I'll paint the chassis. The chassis is just going to be black, I've decided. I think I just prefer that look with all the running gear black, and the body will be a different colour, but that sits on top of it. Because I've got the black wheels and things like that, it works all the way through. It's just nice and plain and simple, and the paint I'll use will probably be pretty easy to touch up. If it ever needs it, I'll probably just use that same engine enamel. It seems to work really well. I might give it a really good coat of a decent primer first, though, to give it a decent amount of protection. But that's coming on really well, I think. As I say, the bolts in the front will need to be set in. So I've been playing with that, and I came up with using a 1-inch spade bit to a certain depth, and then these are actually 8mm bolts at the moment, but I will get a whole bunch of 5/16 high tensile to go through with probably nylock type nuts on the bottom, because you won't see those, and also then it means you can do it up just tight enough so it's all held together, but there's still room there for movement and flexing, and the nylocks won't back off, they won't come undone. So I think that'll work, and I could probably, if I ever fix my 3D printer, I can probably print little plugs that go in there to make those flush, just so they don't end up collecting dirt and dust. And I think that's kind of it on the Riley for today. I probably should do another full update on the bike. I've just been doing lots of little bits and pieces on that. It's coming along really well. The clear coat I used on the fuel tank is petrol proof. I tested that. I've got the wiring loosely in place. I still need to actually cable tie it all to the frame where it needs to go. It came with these special ties, which I don't know that you can get those anymore, so I'll just use normal cable ties. The rear lights on. Whoops. It's coming together. So I did have to get a new headlight bulb for it, and whoops, I managed to find those online locally, and it was $10. And I thought, oh, it seems quite a lot for one bulb, but it turns out it's not one bulb. You actually get a whole box of the things, so they're like $1 each. So now I have a lifetime supply of 6-volt 35-watt high-low beam. I think it's American pre-focus base on these, so that was good. Not everything is ridiculously expensive, it seems, so that's one good thing to be said about restoring bikes rather than cars. It seems to be a lot cheaper. And the other thing I did today was cleaned up the exhaust, and I've painted that with some high temperature black paint. These are the bits of the spark arresters and things. So hopefully I can put the exhaust back on it. This is the main pipe and the muffler. It's really hard to de-rust these to get all the rust off the things, so I don't know how well this paint is going to hold up. Like I say, it is high temperature paint, so it should be good, but it's really hard to completely de-rust these things. I did the best I could. I wouldn't be surprised if they just end up rusting through again. That paint I used is, hello Zelda, is that the same brand of paint I used for the green on the motorcycle. It's a local paint, this Colour Lab stuff. It sprays beautifully. It just sprays so well and covers really well. So this is their high temperature one. I'll see how that holds up. This was the green that I got for the bike. Kiwi fruit. So that's pretty much where the Riley's at for the weekend. It looks quite exotic all covered up like that.